back to the Progressive Rehab and Strength podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rory Alter, head clinical coach here at Progressive Rehab and Strength, with my lovely co-host, as usual, Dr. Alyssa Havison. And we are back to talk more about strength training and programming, as usual. But this is in the fourth and final episode in our series of beginning barbell strength training. We've talked about where you should start with the beginner program, what exercises. We've provided a free program for you to follow that tells you exactly what to do, how to change things. It's like really a fantastic program. We've talked about technique, the PRS lifting manual, how to film your lifts. We've also talked about ways to keep yourself healthy and injury-free under the barbell, and like what is specifically unique about the PRS sustainable training method. And we've linked you to free resources all along the way, including the Sustainable Training Builder and the Healthy Barbell Training Guide. And today we're going to be talking about the perpetual novice or the repeat novice effect. So let's define those two things. So the perpetual novice, well, actually, let's define the repeat novice effect first. So when you're a novice, your body can respond very easily to stimuli. So your training stress. You don't need a lot of volume, you don't need a lot of frequency, and you don't need a lot of load to make progress. And you recover really, really well between training sessions. And the longer you train without an extended interruption, the less novice you become, meaning the less progress you can make in short periods of time. So the less progress you can make every 24 to 36 hours. So as you become less of a novice, you become more of an intermediate lifter. You can make progress on a weekly or monthly basis. And you just need more recovery and more variability and a little bit more training volume, a little bit more training frequency, and generally a little bit less training intensity. So the repeat novice effect is when you have been training for an extended period of time and you start to recover, it takes longer to recover, you need a little bit more volume, a little bit less intensity, and the training becomes a bit more variable. And in general, it takes a little bit more time to train. You have to do a little bit more, all this kind of stuff, right? It's not as easy as it used to be, and your gains don't come as frequently as they used to come. Now, let's say you go through a period of time where you don't have access to barbells, or you were sick, or you had, finals and summer break, and you just, or you were traveling for work for a month and a half, whatever. And you get this extended break from barbell training, which happens to a lot of people, more people than you think that it happens to. You come back to training and your body has had such a gap in training exposure that you can respond like a novice for a short period of time. So one thing that we see people do is that they try and jump right back into the program that they were in before their extended break off, or they try and use the loads that they were using before that gap in training. Sometimes that gap in training is really long, like 6 months, for whatever reason. And so we've coined this term, the repeat novice effect, where you can go back to a beginner program and make a lot of gains really quickly, and sometimes exceed where you were prior to that stop or cessation of training. Now, we don't see that people are able to be on this sustained novice program for as long as they were previously. So maybe you were able to do it for 7 months to a year or a year and a half previously. This time, maybe 4 to 3 months. The longest period of time I've had someone on a novice program utilizing the repeat novice effect, I think, was like 16 weeks, which was really cool because they made so much progress and they exceeded their prior levels of strength. So is there anything that I'm missing about this repeat novice effect?
I don't think so. I think a lot of times when people try to go back to their previous program, it's just a recipe for disaster. It's really hard to go anywhere, and you often will feel defeated because things are really hard. You're not ready for that. But
You're also jumping back into like a lot of volume, high frequency. I
yeah, you
think
don't
that
need that at
recipe,
that point.
yeah, you don't need that. And also, like, just this like recipe for disaster, like this, when you go from a period of sustained lack of activity or lack of training exposure, it's hard to get in that like 4 day a week training session, 4 day a week groove, and you're totally changing your daily routine by adding training back in. So starting with like a 4 day program or a 5 day program is too much for you physically and mentally. So if we can kind of like ease our way back in through a novice program that's much less frequency and much less volume, there's much less recipe for disaster, like you said. So the other thing, so the repeat novice effect is basically just jumping back in with our our barbell beginner training program. And Alyssa, have you? I'm sure you've used this with people more often than not.
Yeah.
Um, and typically, where do you find that someone's loads will start? Some people think, well, why am I going to go back on a beginner program and start so light? You know, and are they starting at loads that are kind of where they started 2 years ago?
It really it depends, Rory. Um, no, it's not going to be like where necessarily exactly where they started as a new lifter. I mean, they could have started 2 years ago with squatting a bar, squatting
Right.
65 pounds. And it really depends on obviously how much progress they made, how strong they got. It's not going to be near what they were doing before that extended break, but it's not an empty bar. It's not 65 pounds, depending on what weight you were lifting before. But it should feel easy. Like day one should feel like, walk in the park.
Yeah, you shouldn't be hitting RP9s that first session back. But I mean, you're right. It depends. It depends on how long your break was. It depends the
Or what the break
reasons
was for.
exactly
How
what the
sick were you for a
if you
month?
were sick. Yeah, exactly. So I think that it always depends, but you can make a lot of, and the longer you've not been training, the more progress and the more time you can um, probably get out of the novice linear progression again, or the beginner barbell training program. Um, so this repeat novice effect is really cool. I don't think people utilize it enough. But basically, the repeat novice effect, like we said, is this lack of exposure to training stress that allows you to respond like a novice again, with your like that base of strength that you developed over the last 2, 3, 4 years doesn't just go away. Like you cannot train for 6 months and still be way stronger than you were 2 years ago. And you also just aren't, you most likely, unless you've not been training for like a whole year or 2 years, you're not going to get as much time out of that beginner program again. So you'll probably make faster progress in a shorter period of time. And you definitely want to make changes to this much quicker than you would in the novice, in the first round of novice exposure to training. Um, so then the other thing, what was the other thing that I mentioned in the beginning of this?
Perpetual novices.
Perpetual novices, thank you. So perpetual novices are the person who trains and burns themselves out on a novice program because they train too hard. They ran fives forever, and fives are not the only thing that novices should be doing. There's a whole progression from fives to top sets with drop sets, or to threes, and then to a single, and then then light, and then don't forget your light day for the squat. And you can really progress all the lifts to for much longer than someone if you were just running with fives. And we're also taking into account how hard those things are, and we're making these small tweaks along the way. Um, but generally, we see the perpetual novice is someone who has burned themselves out on fives, been on a novice linear progression for way too long, not utilizing the PRS beginner barbell training program. And this has led to an injury or a lack of motivation to train and ultimately cessation of training. And they stop training because training sessions are too long and they have other life factors and they don't figure out how to balance training with their life, and their recovery is poor, blah, 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 right? And so then they take a year off because they can't figure out how to feel good outside of training. And so they put it on the back burner for a little while. And then they're like, you know what? I feel better about training. My injuries don't hurt anymore. I feel well recovered. Feel a little bit more motivated to train. Life has settled down a little bit. Let me train again. And then they start with a novice linear progression again, right? So there's the perpetual novice, and that person is always going to be on a novice linear progression because they're not following a program or adjusting the program the right way to sustain them long term and transition with them as their recovery transitions to less beginner and more intermediate and advanced. So if you find yourself a perpetual novice, stop running fives forever and download our our sustainable training builder, but also our PRS beginner barbell training program, because you will get out of Groundhog's Day with just burning yourselves out on fives.
The perpetual novice is the person who, when you ask what their recent training looks like, it's always, well, I never got past fives at this weight,
I know.
you know?
And I'm like, oh, yeah, right. So
Got stuck.
anyway, let's say you're restarting barbell training for whatever reason. We do have our restart barbell. What is it called? I forget what it's called. Oh, Lordy.
Optimize your restart to barbell
Yes,
training.
optimize your restart to barbell training. So in this free guide, we talk about how to restart barbell training after an extended period, whether that's 4 weeks or 3 months or a year or 2 years or whatever. We put this guide together during the global pandemic, which we will not name. And we put it together because people were going from working out at home or not having access to barbells to getting back into the gym and now having access to barbells. So they were going months without touching a barbell, so they weren't a repeat novice. But the typical person in that situation would say, well, I'm an intermediate or advanced lifter, even though I haven't been lifting for 6 months. So I'm going to go back to an intermediate or advanced program. No.
No, you're not anymore.
You're now a novice again. So anyway, we put this guide together then, and our barbell beginner strength training program did not exist then. So what we suggest is, if you're finding yourself in this repeat novice situation, or you're the perpetual novice, we suggest downloading the Restart Barbell Training Guide. Is that what it's called? And which we'll link in the show notes below. And combining it with the Barbell Beginner Strength Training Program, which we talked about 3 episodes ago. The thing to note that's different with that's additional with this guide is that we lay out more of the intermediate program and the intermediate strategies in this episode. In this guide. Woof, we recorded a lot today. We had a blooper with my equipment, so I'm like, woo. So we have a little bit more information on the programming for intermediates in this, because obviously if you've, been barbell training and you only took like 2 or 3 months off, you're going to get to that intermediate stage a little bit faster than someone else. So we do include some of the intermediate elements of programming in this guide. So what we suggest doing is downloading the Sustainable Training Builder, where you can input your own program. And I think that our builder also has our VLI. So our VLI program, which is the PRS intermediate program, there are drop downs in the Sustainable Training Builder for the intermediate program that we're talking about in this guide. So you can build your own intermediate program in the Sustainable Training Builder once you have finished the beginner barbell strength training program. And then you can start tracking your training and making training adjustments to your intermediate training as well. So that's what's really cool about this. It kind of takes you from, 2 3 month hiatus to training, or 2 year hiatus to training, and helps you transition into intermediate programming.
I just want to say that, we're kind of talking about this as though it's simple and easy. We understand that this can be very frustrating for someone who's been training for a while, especially having a few months off and having to take a step back when returning to training. It's not always that easy emotionally to do. And a lot of people have will say, okay, they've lost a lot of strength. If depending on how long of a time you've had off, it's not so much that you've lost strength, is that your body just is not used to or ready for the weight that you were lifting before. So that's why one of the reasons why we see progress quickly is because you're getting used to the weight again and you still are strong. But and again, we know that it's frustrating, but taking this step back and then seeing yourself starting to make progress and just thinking like looking forward, not behind you,
Mm-hmm.
it moves quickly.
Yeah, I mean, especially the looking behind you thing. Like, I used to be able to do this, or this is what I was doing then. You're different now. We grow every single day. We get a little bit older every single day. We have different life stresses, uh, and obligations, and all those things that affect us differently 6 months from now than they did 6 months ago. And even, you know, just your comment about motivation. And I know it's hard to like get back in through a beginner, like a transition, like a beginner transition into training. Um, we've all had injuries, and when you get injured, we take huge step back, but we apply those beginner principles to recovering from an injury, right? And even after I had my son, I trained through. It was actually interesting. So the first 20 weeks of my pregnancy, I didn't train at all because I was so sick. So I had 20 weeks off from training, and I was also 20 weeks pregnant at that point. And so then it's a totally different body. And I think I started lifting again with like 60 kilos for my squat, but I started with a beginner program. Even though I was an advanced lifter when I got pregnant, I didn't train for 20 weeks, and I was also 20 weeks pregnant. So who I was 20 weeks prior to that was completely different. And it was hard. Mentally, it's hard to be like, well, I could squat over 300 pounds 20 weeks ago, and here I am now squatting 135 pounds. And then again, like, I trained through my pregnancy, couldn't train as frequently, couldn't train as many lifts per training session. It was very different. And then after I had my baby, I had a C-section. So recovering from that took another 6 weeks off. I think I probably trained like stopped training like 1 or 2 weeks before I had him because I just wasn't feeling good. So I wasn't training for 8 weeks again, and then had a major surgery, um, and started again with the novice linear progression. And to be honest, up until recently, I was a perpetual novice for the last 2 years because of how much interruption there has been to training. Sometimes I'd go 2 weeks without training. But the thing is that even when you feel like, and I think this is kind of what for the perpetual novice, like, what I see in people who I've identified as perpetual novices is that they'll go those 2 weeks without training for whatever life throws at them, and then they won't adjust their training to kind of take 2 weeks back, and then it's too hard for them. They feel shitty after because they're like overtrained from that one training session. They're sore, they're tired, they need 2 or 3 days to recover because they haven't lifted in 2 weeks. And then they're like, you know what, I'm just not doing it. Like, I don't have time for that. And then 2 weeks becomes 4 weeks, 4 weeks becomes 6 weeks, 6 weeks becomes 6 months. So the key is to really assess where you're at 2 weeks and be honest with yourself. and say, I have to step back and drop 5% or repeat the loads that I did last time so that I don't fall into this perpetual novice situation, right? And that's something that we built into our beginner barbell strength training program. So when you go into the beginner barbell strength training program, you input the date that you're training before you start your training session, and it will calculate how long it's been since your last training session, and it'll tell you to either repeat the loads, go up in weight, or drop 5% or something like that. And that's kind of how we can calibrate the loads for that day based on how long it's been since you trained so that you don't fall into this perpetual novice thing. But so I thankfully was able to kind of do that. So I basically just extended this like novice linear progression for 2 years. But then I got really sick. When was it? I got really sick last summer in August. I was basically sick from like the end of July through the beginning of September. I was just sick. Remember that, Alyssa? It's just
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
I came back from Colorado and I got sick, and then we went on vacation and I stayed sick, and then I ended up in the hospital, and then it was just like trying to recover from all of that. I probably didn't train for like six weeks. Um and so that's kind of like, but there's phases in life where you're gonna kind of be this perpetual novice. Sometimes you just have to take a step back from training and other things are priority, like your health, your family, all those types of things. But the key is to just not stop training so that you're not really causing these very large gaps, like a whole year goes by and you haven't trained. You got to monitor and adjust your training so that you don't get hit by a bus every single time you train. If that makes sense. Why are you laughing? You're like, I
The
feel
hit by a
you.
bus.
Yeah. Sometimes like if you feel like you got hit by a bus after you trained, that training session was too heavy. That training session was too high volume and too heavy. But anyway, so I've experienced the repeat novice effect. You've experienced the repeat novice effect. I don't think my husband has ever experienced it because I don't think that he's ever missed a week of training. Never more than like a couple days. So if you're not John Patrizzo, then you've probably experienced the repeat novice effect at some point. Um, anyway, so the restart to barbell training guide, complete guide, whatever we call it, the link is in our show notes. We really just wanted to put together this month of podcast episodes to help guide the person who's interested in barbell training but hasn't yet barbell trained. This is kind of your guide to the whole process of going from never touching a barbell or never touching a barbell and doing a squat, bench, deadlift, and overhead press to transitioning to an intermediate lifter. Excuse me. If you're an athlete and you're interested in helping your friends or your family lift, or you want to start getting into coaching, this month of podcast episodes and all of these free resources are really your go-to. Just study them, download them, listen to the podcast episodes, go through each resource, utilize the resources with your friends and family. And the same thing for the personal trainer who's just exercising people and you want to become a strength coach or a barbell strength coach. This is like your beginner course on that. And the same thing for the clinician who wants to implement this into their clinical practice. All these things, all these programs that we're talking about, all these free guides, you don't need a barbell. You can do it without the barbell. So all these principles apply to non-barbell exercise implements as well. So with that said, we hope that these couple of episodes have been helpful and useful for you, that these resources are useful for you. And don't forget to join our free Facebook group, The Secret Society of Barbell Mastery. We do form checks, we answer your questions, we do a live Facebook Q&A the last Thursday, almost the last Thursday of almost every month. Sometimes it's not the last Thursday and sometimes it doesn't happen at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And you can join our newsletter to access our podcast early and our free literature review and a free case study every month. So hope to see you guys soon.